Hello, friends. I'm Julie Silber, and I'm welcoming you to episode 4 of 6 Quilts, 6 Know-It-Alls. The 5 Know-It-Alls and I want to thank you very much for being here. Those of you who are new and those of you who've been to some of our other episodes, thank you so much. We couldn't do this without you, and we really appreciate you. Today we're going to do a theme called myth busting, and each of us is going to take one myth on and talk about it, and then we'll have some discussion about it. We're going to start with Lynne, Lynne Bassett is an independent scholar specializing in historic costume and textiles. Among her many projects are award-winning exhibitions and catalogs, including Homefront and Battlefield, Quilts in Context in the Civil War, co-authored with Madeline Shaw in 2012, and many other books and exhibitions. Lynne.
Okay, thank you so much, Julie. I'm going to share my screen and so I get to deal with the earliest period myth, quilts in the colonial period. Early quilt historians, including Carrie Hall and Rose Kretzinger, promoted the idea that quilts were integral to the life of the early colonists, saying that, you know, they stitched together colorful scraps of leftover bits of fabric to brighten their dreary hovels in the early days. And in the Romance of the Patchwork Quilt, which I have to say is very appropriately named, they actually wrote that quilts were so intimately connected with the everyday life of the colonists that no record of them exists. This idea was picked up and carried on by early quilt historian after early quilt historian, including Patsy Orlovsky in her seminal book, Quilts in America, which I know is still being used as a teaching text to this day. And Orlovsky stated that the history of the earliest quilts must be an interpretive one. And that's not the way historical documentation works. To fit their narrative, these and other authors are actually ignoring historical evidence. There's actually plenty of evidence of early bed covers in the colonial period, which I have to tell you, by the way, if you're not familiar, is like 1607 is the settling of Jamestown. And then we go up to the end of the Revolutionary War, which is 1783. So this is the period we're talking about. So there's lots of evidence of what people covered their beds with in that period. And it's not quilts, it's bed rugs was a #1 choice. And I'll talk about what bed rugs are in a future 6 Know-It-Alls. But within this myth, there are other myths. It's like stacking myth upon myth. And in a couple of the state quilt books that have been published, there are claims to the earliest quilt made or used in America. And in most cases, this just isn't correct. In the Virginia quilt book, there is this quilt that is said to have been made by the great-great-grandmother of George Washington, and it's said to have been made with slips, which are individual embroidered motifs. And if you look at it carefully, if you understand what you're looking at, these are not slips. This is a typical mid-18th century crewelwork coverlet that was probably quilted sometime later. And not only that, it's not English, it's American. If you look, it's a plain woven fabric background. If you understand these early whole cloth wool quilts, you'll recognize these designs as being no later or no earlier than the mid-18th century. So I'm not saying that she didn't make a quilt in the 17th century. That's possible. I'm saying that it wasn't this quilt. There was quilting in the colonial period, as we see in this ad in the Boston newsletter in the early 18th century. George Brownell was teaching English and French quilting. So what's that? Okay, French quilting is the Marseille work, such as this cap, which was generally used for smaller objects. English quilting was the framed center medallion whole cloth quilts. This is a quilt that was that's documented to have been imported to Boston from England in 1747, and there were hundreds of these quilts coming over ready-made. And I also know of a Philadelphia area quilt that was made in Philadelphia, and it has these exact same motifs. So you can't really tell if they're teaching how to do in the English type of quilting. They're using the same motifs and the same layout. You really can't tell which is the earliest or which was made here. Okay, Mary Abbott Bridges, I think, is actually the earliest quilt that we can be confident was made here in colonial America. This was made in Massachusetts around 1738 when she married her husband. And it still has that frame center medallion, but it's broken out into these wild stylized florals, which becomes the New England style of whole cloth quilts. The other important thing to keep in mind is that there were way more quilted petticoats made than bed quilts. Quilting was not much used for the bed. It was mostly made to be worn in the colonial period. My research in diaries shows that quilted petticoats were made 3-to-1 for bed quilts. And in fact, when you see in a probate inventory or in an advertisement, if you see just the word quilt, they're talking about a petticoat. They're talking about a quilted petticoat. They're not talking about a bed quilt. When they're talking about a bed quilt, they specifically say bed quilt. And I know of a couple from Massachusetts in the 1730s. So moving now to patchwork, we have what I believe is the earliest documented American patchwork. This was made by Deborah Hobart Clark of Danvers, Massachusetts, probably in the 1730s or 1740s. This is exactly what Jonathan Swift, the English satirist and author of Gulliver's Travels, was describing when he wrote in Directions to Servants in 1726. He was making fun of the idea of cutting up clothing, quote, to make patchwork for screens, stools, cushions, and the like. So that's exactly what Deborah was doing. She's making a hand screen here, which is what this is. It's missing its handle now. And she basted small triangles of silk over paper templates. Deborah was born into wealth and undoubtedly received instruction in the finest needlework, probably in Boston, and she would have been aware of the latest fancy work fashions, including patchwork. A final example of colonial era quilting is this patchwork quilt that descended in the Leverett and Saltonstall families of Boston. And like Deborah Hobart Clark's hand screen, this was pieced of silk basted over paper templates. The paper templates were not removed. They weren't removed in the 18th century. But these ones were removed in the 1930s. And when they took them out, they saw this scrap from a 1701 Harvard catalog. And so they assumed that the quilt was made in 1701. But Paula Richter and Deborah Craik and I looked at this quilt really, really carefully. And what you have going on here actually is that all the patches in the center, and if you can kind of blur your eyes and see that there's a difference in the fabrics in the center than from the border, the center patches are mid 18th century silks. The patches on the outer borders are late 18th century silks. So this is a 2-generation quilt made somewhere between about the 1740s and 1800. So it's not 1701. She was just cutting up old papers. And then just to show you this wonderful wool ball fringe that edges the quilt. So while it would seem to make sense that patchwork quilting in this country began out of necessary for the early English colonists, we have to look at documentation without preconceived ideas. And that's what I've got for you. Do you want me to keep this up?
Sure.
Sure. Well, and for one thing, I mean, look how fine and expensive those are. Those are all obviously imported, as most textiles were, of, you know, from the coarse to the finest at this period. But, you know, this is not a poor woman saving scraps. This is a woman who has access to many, many, many different silks, and some of them might be hers, and some of them might be furnishing fabrics, and some of them might be, you know, from family. But this is not necessity and frugality. This is a woman who has a lot of time on her hands and access to a lot of different fabrics to make this thing.
When you really think about it, the sort of fabrics that the poor pilgrims were working with were wools and linens.
Right.
You know, very little silk, very little cotton. These aren't the sort of fabrics that are conducive to patchwork to begin with.
Right.
And these early pieces that like the Deborah Hobart Clark, the whole cloth, the Mary from Massachusetts, anyway, and the Saltonstalls, they are all documented to be extremely wealthy families that owned slaves. These are all slave owning families.
So Lynne, just one quick question. What is the batting in this?
This one didn't have batting. This was just the silk with the paper.
But what about in general? What kind of batting were they? When you mentioned, I mean, where were they getting their cotton? If it was cotton batting,
well, like the Anatol's quilt from 1785 that's at the Wadsworth Athenaeum. That one is actually finished, and it still has its paper templates in it, but it's actually finished. It has a wool batting.
Okay.
The whole cloth wool quilts, they have wool batting.
So Lynne, am I to understand that the idea that poor people very long ago, pilgrims, very poor people, picked up and found whatever they could to put things together to make a quilt, and that was the beginning of quilting in America, is false? What you're saying is that only wealthy people, and much later than pilgrims, were making what we consider patchwork and whole cloth and other quilts. Is that right?
Right. What I'm saying is what we know of the documentation now is that quilts were owned only by wealthy families well into the 18th century. The earliest documented quilts in America, the earliest documentation for a quilt is 1685. The earliest quilt that we can be sure was made here is like 1730s. And so, right, they're
always by people of wealth.
And by people, wealthy people. This quilt is from the family of the governor of Massachusetts. Many quilts are generally connected to ministers who were the creme de la creme in communities in this period.
We're down.
Yeah,
Barbara. Out of tiny scraps of calico in the colonial period. And I think it's very important to remember that we really don't see a lot of patchwork quilts in America till the 1780s. We don't even see nearly any until the 1780s. And then about 1800, there's an explosion of interest. But it's because calico was so expensive and so unavailable. It was Indian, it was imported all to Europe. But then about 1780, Europeans, especially the English, started making a cheaper printed cotton, and that was sent to us, and that's when we started seeing calico. So when you think of the colonial period with calico, little scraps of aprons and dresses, it's just an anachronism.
Do you know of any, even in the 18th century, in the late 18th century, are you referring to patchwork quilts sort of starting up then? Sort of what we think of as with little squares of either cotton or linen?
In 1780s, you start seeing dated quilts that can be attributed to America.
Okay.
Patchwork. We have full cloth, and certainly the silk quilts we're talking about. But the actual, you start seeing something that looks like an American quilt about 1780. But by 1800, then it starts.
Right, with the Industrial Revolution, the whole change in technology and fabrics becoming cheap and all that sort of stuff, then it really changes.
And we might have to
Well, I think we need to move on.
This is exactly right. We need to, this is exactly right.
That was a great one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, and my new task now is to introduce Barbara. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce Barbara Brackman, who is a quilt historian and author from Lawrence, Kansas. She's written many books over the past 40 years, indexing patterns, exploring women's history through their quilt making, and giving guidelines for dating fabrics and quilts. She writes several blogs about quilt history, including material culture and Civil War quilts. Take it away, Barbara.
Take it away, Barbara. All right, we're going to try and share our screens here. Always iffy. So we usually show an antique quilt, but I want to start with this quilt that a pen pal of mine sent a picture of recently. Trish Gao, who is from Buenos Aires, Argentina. She teaches quilting down there, and I love to see what she's doing. And she heard I was going to do this talk, and she said, "Let me send you my Underground Railroad quilt." And I'm very fond of Trish, and I don't want to say, "Wait a minute, it's a myth." But what amazes me is that in Buenos Aires, people are thinking that there is a code that was imparted by slaves who were thinking about running away and told in quilt patterns. She certainly enjoyed making this quilt. It tells a story in her mind of a slave who escaped, and then we have a double wedding ring down there, and she got married and she lived happily ever after. But it's a myth. It's a myth. And I think it's very important to look at why myths are so durable. Laurel Horton did a wonderful paper at the American Quilt Study Group a couple of years ago, in which she talked about the grief she was given when she decided she would call people on this myth. And what she found, it's the experience of belief. People want to believe something. Facts have nothing to do with it. And that's what a myth is. A myth is often so ingrained in our idea of who we are that it's very, very difficult to change people's minds. And I think what Laurel's talking about here is very relevant to our situation in the United States today, where we have people who believe things and science and facts are not part of the factor. Now I'll refresh this. I think most of you know about this Underground Railroad myth. A couple of years ago, maybe 20, some authors wrote that there was a code. They had talked to a woman who was selling baskets in a market in South Carolina, and she said there was a secret code that very few people knew about, and each one of these quilt patterns imparted information to a runaway or a potential runaway about how to escape to freedom. Now, there are many ways to discourage this. We have no documentary evidence. Nobody's ever written a letter or described in her past a quilt like this, but it's certainly a good story. There are many patterns in this myth that are code, and here are 3. Now, it would seem when I first started looking at this that you would want to prove that these patterns existed before January 1863, which is the end of the Underground Railroad. The Emancipation Proclamation changed everything, and no longer, the whole idea of escaping secretly was no longer important. So let's look at 3 patterns real quickly. The drunkard's path, which told you that you were supposed to run in mysterious, convoluted ways. But the drunkard's path, the earliest I've ever seen the data on it is 1884. And that confirms what I see over and over again in undated examples, is that it is indeed an 1880s pattern and very popular in the early 20th century, but not in 1850 when the Underground Railroad was at its height. Another quilt pattern that is important to the code is the log cabin. And the earliest that I found with a date actually written on it is this 1874 quilt. And I've seen references in the 1860s during the war, the Civil War, that it was a Union pattern to sort of commemorate Abraham Lincoln and his log cabin birthplace. But it's certainly not something you're going to see in the 1850s and the 1840s. Now, the most egregious error to me is the fishing boats. This boat was going to tell you that you had to run along rivers. And the thing about the boat pattern is that the earliest I've ever seen the pattern is 1931. I don't have many dated examples because it's kind of a quilt that was more for utility and for kids and for fun, so that rather than a masterpiece, so people would sign it. But the earliest that I've seen is in the 30s. It is not, as the Chicago Tribune told us in 1933, the earliest of the colonial quilt patterns. How about that one? So what we have here is oral tradition versus written tradition. I'm a person who is very much in favor of book learning. I'm a reader. I love to find evidence for what I'm talking about in people's diaries, letters, and personal accounts. And I'm not much of a storyteller. I don't come from that culture. I'm from New York. We read books when I was a kid. We didn't listen to grandma. She didn't have many stories to tell us anyway. But I realize that there are many cultures that do have an oral tradition that is so important to the way things are passed on. Where you have 2 clues into our Native American culture, this wonderful picture from 1905 where this man here is drawing in the dirt and he's telling a story, and you can see how mesmerized his listeners are. And then here's a more contemporary view from a Pueblo Native American community. It's called The Storyteller by Helen Cordero. And I don't know if these are her listeners, but I think they're probably the stories, the characters in her stories that are crawling all over her. And you can see she's kind of in a trance telling these stories. And so the oral tradition is extremely important in many cultures. And it's more, I think, people will say, well, it's something that you might see in the Black tradition, like the Uncle Remus stories. But it really seems to me to be more Southern versus Northern, or storytelling, my mama told me idea, rather than let's look at the historical facts. And what we find is that the myths are there because they help us define ourselves. And I think that we can go back into many reasons why. Let's say why people like to believe that the early colonists in their little hovels were piecing quilts. And it sort of tells us that despite horrible deprivations and New England winters, these people survived, they persevered, and they were the creators of our American culture. Now, that, of course, negates every other group of people besides the Puritans, but that was the colonial revival in the early 20th century, where everyone was sort of compared to that English Puritan structure. And that myth helped define our culture, that these were the hardy people. When we look at the Underground Railroad, it tells us that African-American people were smart enough to have a code and smart enough to keep it secret from other people. And that it doesn't enable us to see how the Underground Railroad worked. Well, we have no trouble if we go to my book learning reliance on finding stories that were published about the true workings of the Underground Railroad. And for example, William Still here. I've been reading William Still's book. He wrote a book in 1870 about his actions during the Underground Railroad years. Here he is. He's unboxing a man named Henry Brown, who crated himself up in Richmond, Virginia, and shipped him to William's office in Philadelphia. They knew he was coming, so they were all there ready to help him. And he came out. He'd been in the box for 36 hours. I mean, that's such a better story than a sailboat on a quilt, but that story just doesn't have legs. It just doesn't stick. And I think we have to look at what the important part of myths are to defining our culture before we dismiss them. So I've been trying to fight this myth for 20 or 30 years. My best tool, I think, is to offer alternative quilts, alternative patterns that tell the true story. But they don't have any of the appeal of the Underground Railroad code. So what do you guys think after looking?
So we can rename the tumbling blocks for the Henry Box Brown.
You know, the source of this, I think the one thing, I have lots of friends who aren't really quilt knowledgeable, and they come up with this, you know, they tell me about the Underground Railroad, and I said, you know, that's not true. And really? Well, tell me why. And when I say that it really originated with a children's book, right?
Right.
In what,
1990 something.
1980s?
80s, probably.
I mean, they're just shocked. And really, it's incredible to think that all of this has come from that made up, the fictional story of, it's a wonderful story. We want to believe it. We want to believe that people worked like that. They were ingenious, but.
We want quilts included.
The angle I've been taking lately to try to combat this myth is to point out what a disservice it is to the memory of actual escaped slaves and the bravery and the cleverness that was required to escape, and the idea that somebody could just follow the clues given in a quilt is ridiculous. I mean, it would be so much easier just to whisper in somebody's ear than that everybody be prepared with the right quilt and be able to put it out at the right time. I mean, the whole thing is completely ridiculous. So to me, I find this myth just profoundly offensive to the actual history and the memory of escaped slaves. The other thing I want to make sure everybody understands in the discussion of oral versus written history is that there were thousands of oral histories taken of slaves and abolitionists from the 1860s to the 1930s, and the quilt code does not appear once in any of those oral histories. So there is no oral tradition of this story.
1980.
And then the other thing I wanted to, sorry, there's a little wrench I'm throwing in here.
Okay, good.
But log cabin blocks actually do show up earlier than we all thought. In the brand new Maine quilt book, I suspected that this might be coming up, the brand new book about Maine quilts. If you look on page 71, 72, 73, there's a group of quilts that were made and that are inscribed. They're from 1850, and 3 of these quilts have log cabin blocks on them.
Well, I
That's
haven't.
amazing.
I have to buy it.
But I'd like to say on top of what you've said about the oral histories, and all that is true. So it's not that we as historians respect only documents. Oral history
right.
can be very useful, but we have, as you say, thousands of oral histories, and none of them mention quilts. But also, you know, that's just not how the Underground Railroad works. There's lots of knowledge about how that chain of people helping slaves worked, and very, very, very few made it on their own. But also, I'd like to throw in the logic. I mean, one is supposedly people are making and distributing quilts with the really profound knowledge that you would have to follow the North Star because you were heading north. I'm sorry, I think they were smart enough to know you to head north without, and they knew the North Star without a quilt.
Not to mention the fact that in the historical record, we actually know that most slaves actually escaped south.
Oh, that's it.
North.
Actually escaped
What?
south. That's
They
interesting
actually
too.
escaped
But
south. They went
also,
into the
but
swamps.
wait,
They went into the swamps. They formed gullah communities. They escaped by going into cities and blending in, or going on shipboard where they could be
Right.
sailors. The sailor career was very integrated. Most of them didn't actually go north.
So we know a lot about escaped slaves, and none of it has to do with this working. But I just wanted to throw one more thing. It never made sense to me, this idea that certain patterns were coded to say this is a friendly house for you to stop at, which is the other quilt code myth. One is these are the directions for how to escape. The other is, oh, look for this pattern because that means it's a friendly abolitionist who will take you in. First of all, how do you know it's a friendly abolitionist who knows the code and not her nasty slave owning pro-slavery neighbor who just happened to like that pattern? Secondly, you're traveling at night. Are you really going to be putting out a quilt for people to not be able to see at night? And thirdly, if you're just wandering, thinking that maybe some random slave is going to be escaping, do you really leave your quilt out on the line or on the porch day after day after day?
Well, that is especially
to wonder about that. It just
especially,
doesn't stand up to scrutiny on the most basic common sense level. That's all I'm saying.
you're absolutely right. And in this area, Maryland and Pennsylvania, it's especially relevant because a lot of the Underground Railroad lines came through. If a quilt was hanging not at washing time, it was and was put out various times during the year, even in the winter, it would have been a signal that everyone knew that that was a place that was signaling on the railroad.
Right.
And
if that had been true.
yes, and we have to
just
move
wouldn't
on.
have worked as a code.
We have to move on.
Okay.
We could do a whole
We could.
on just this because we have so much fun. But we're going to go on to Merikay Waldvogel, who's a very good friend of mine. And I'm going to introduce her. She is from Tennessee. She lives in Tennessee. And she is an expert on Tennessee quilts. She and Bets Ramsey wrote the book Quilts of Tennessee many years ago, one of the first of the state projects. And I have to say that many of us also worked on books from our own states, which is how we sort of got interested in quilts. So here's Merikay Waldvogel.
Thank you, Barbara. My myth I chose or was given to me is about the presence of cotton seeds in batting and whether or not it establishes a quilt's age. So, true or false? It turns out, according to Barbara in Clues in the Calico, that the earliest source is probably none other than Ruth Finley in her book, Old Patchwork Quilts and the Women Who Made Them, published in 1929. And that's, I think, important to remember is that she was writing for an audience in the colonial revival time period who were beginning to value their family's quilts. And the antique quilts they were talking about were quilts 100 years earlier, would have gone way back to the 1830s. And in her book, she gives this a bit of a warning, or maybe a suggestion to the new quilt buyers. And this is actually where we see the source of this myth. She writes, in an antique shop or private sale where the owner has no real data, no provenance to go by, a quilt held to the light for a glance at the fill will give the would-be purchaser a fairly trustworthy idea as to whether the piece was made before or after 1850. A quilt held to the light for a glance at the fill. It's always fun to read these books, and I encourage you to go back and read it. Here is her argument. To a quilt collector, the ginning of cotton is especially important because, she writes, the presence of seeds in the fill of a quilt helps establish its age. She suggests that if you look, seeds will appear as little dark spots, about as big around as the end of an ordinary pencil. And finally, she even comes up with the formula where she looks at how many seeds are present per inch in a quilt held to the light. And she basically says that quilts made after 1850 will show seeds few and far between as the ginning technology improved. So let's take a look at my quilt I purchased in Tennessee in a way that she described. It was a private sale. They knew nothing about it. I purchased it for a lot of reasons. I've given it a date of 1850, and I thought, well, let's just take this quilt and see if what Ruth has suggested holds up. And indeed, when you hold my quilt up to the light, you can see all these little black specks that I have circled in blue. And the one in red, I want you to look at particularly because the diamond quilting on this entire quilt is, the side of that is 1/2 inch. You can almost count the stitches there, and there are 6 inches to 1/2 inch. The quilting on this quilt was exceptionally fine, and it's so thin that you could look through it. And that's one of the aspects that I was curious about. I wondered if there was a way to prove maybe that this was hand carded cotton. Really, there's an enormous amount of handwork on this quilt. Just as for comparison purposes, again, the red currants that are there in applique are about 1 1/4 inch across. So yes, let's go back to what Ruth said. Seeds will appear as little dark spots, few and far between. And she says it's probably 1850. And lo and behold, she and I do agree about the date. But the specks are not seeds. And I would like to show you the 5 brown seeds on the left are cotton seeds. The 5 yellow ones are kernels of popcorn. Cotton seeds are the same size as popcorn, and more importantly, like kernels of popcorn, you would never bite into one of these. They break a tooth, much less a needle. They are much bigger round than the end of a pencil. No self-respecting quilt maker is going to put a top on a quilt and then quilt it if she could see the seeds, and they're really easy to see. In fact, those specks are plant debris, bits of stem, hull, etc. Let's take a look at a mature cotton boll ready to be picked. The one on the left is, again, pretty close to be picked. That bowl started out as the size of a walnut, about that. Now that's left after the bloom of the cotton plant has faded away, and we end up with this bowl. And inside are, in this case, 3 little sacks, seed sacks, and that are tightly covered with a fiber. So inside the sacks are several seeds. And when it got on a really hot day, and the cotton itself starts to burst, it's time for the field to be picked. And of course, there were people picking the cotton in the 1800s, and now it's a totally mechanized process. But basically, there are still 3 major steps from getting a bowl to a spinning stage. There's picking, that would be pulling out those little seed pods, then ginning, which is separating the seeds from the cotton fiber, and carding, which is essentially the final step before spinning, and you're looking for the specks one more time, trying to get out as much as you can. The machine, of course, would be doing this today, and getting the fibers all in parallel to make it easier for spinning. And this, I think, is what Ruth missed in her dating suggestions. That all throughout the 19th century, machine ginned and machine carded cotton for quilt batting was not debris free. There really wasn't an accurate way to count the little specks in the batting, even as late as the early 20th century. I mean, there's a way to count it, but it doesn't really mean anything. And you could see here some early cotton batting that has a lot of debris in it. In 1902, in the Sears Roebuck and Company catalog, they are advertising cotton batting, different grades of it. And you'll notice here that they, even in 1902, they're saying things like, our batting is not simply a wad of cotton to be re-picked and put into the quilt in bunches. And finally, in 1919, and remember what's going on in 1919, Marie Webster's beautiful, very sophisticated quilts are coming onto the market with a white background, and the quality of quilt batting improves greatly. As they say here, it was pure white, snowy, fluffy from the best cotton districts of the South. Again, probably machine carded, but very fine and white. So what I thought was interesting when I moved here was that even well into the 20th century, hand ginning and hand carding of cotton went on in areas where large-scale cotton growing was not possible. Now that's where I live, right where that red star is, in Knoxville, Tennessee. And I've run into several women who've said, well, I grew a row of cotton in my garden just so that I would have some batting, some cotton to make into batting during the winter time. And so here you see the cotton gin really hasn't changed much since 1792. That was, of course, just the basic equipment, but a very similar one was being used in 1936, ginning cotton by hand in the Smoky Mountain National Park with the Walker sisters. And again, this is probably a staged scene, and I think we're dealing maybe with nostalgia here. We were probably dealing with nostalgia here in 1987. I was part of a group called the Thursday Bee of the Smoky Mountain Quilters of Tennessee. We had all worked on one of those state quilt projects, and we decided at the end that we wanted to make a quilt, or we were encouraged to make a quilt that was made just like it was made in the 19th century. So using fabrics dyed that way, using patterns we found in our state survey. And then finally we decided we have to have a hand carded bat inside. I'm not sure why, but that's what we did. And we had a friend who grew cotton in her garden, and she provided enough cotton that year so that we made a really incredible, we laid all the cotton little bats out and overlapped them, and then put the top down, did the basting, and eventually quilted it all by hand. So in conclusion, if you hold a quilt up to the light and see specks, what you see is probably plant debris and not seeds. So Ruth Findlay's, the myth based on that is probably false if we're just talking about seeds. But does seedy batting, and that's something that people are using nowadays to describe it, like what we see on the left, does it help date a quilt? Well, it's not a strong clue, because nowadays we have so many other ways to date quilts. So is this a myth? I mean, what do we learn from looking into the history of this myth? I'll throw that back to you. Thank you.
I'd say that's a myth busted.
Yeah.
Yes.
I can tell you anecdotally from when I had my shop in the 1970s here in California. A woman came in one time and we were talking about quilts, and she was in her 80s or something like that. And she was from Texas, and I think we probably did it in the 1970s, probably held up a quilt and said, see, cotton seeds. And you know, live and learn. But this woman said that she had grown up in Texas, and in the late teens and 20s, they themselves went out into their field and picked the cotton to put in their own quilts.
Right.
So that
It
was that,
yeah.
and that was
Wow.
as late as 1920s or 30s in
Well,
Texas.
that's kind of what I was saying, is this
Yeah.
lasted a lot longer. They talk about scrapping. I've interviewed African-American quilters who went out into the fields after the ginning was, or the picking was done, and there was still a lot of fluffy stuff out there, and they'd pick enough to make something. So
You know,
that just means that, yeah, there's no way. It tells you more about the quality than it
Right.
does about the.
I
the
think that's
dating.
exactly.
You know, now we can look at the fabric, at the print style, at the style of the quilt. The pattern will give you the date. Is it a framed medallion? Is it a block style? I mean, there's so many other ways. And, you know, give Ruth her due, I guess, even though, you know, she's the source of so darn many myths. She was kind of trying to figure it out at the very, very beginning. But, you know, sadly, she didn't do any actual research. She just kind of made it up as she went along, it seems like.
I found
I've
a
got-
couple of, I'll be quick here. They're not quite on the subject of seeds, but there was some really interesting stuff in that ad that you showed, Mary Kay. The tinted wadding.
Yeah.
Isn't that cool?
Yeah.
They were dyeing wadding all the way back in the 18th century.
Yeah.
Just so you know,
Really?
you find colored wool inside quilts sometimes. I also just was wondering, they use both the term wadding and batting.
Yeah.
Is there a difference?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I think so.
What do you think, Barbara?
Well, I don't know. I'm thinking wadding might be something you would do for what we call trapunto, but stuffed quilting. I don't know. I thought in that ad, I mean, we could spend 15 minutes on that ad.
Right.
They offered 4 kinds of
Yeah.
quilt batting, and the highest level was medicinal. And I hope many of you heard Carolyn Muzz when we were talking about her first quilt and how she decided she had to have 100% cotton batting in the days of polyester, and she got medicinal cotton batting at the drugstore, and she had to buy a lot of it. And the druggist thought she had a sick family member. My favorite story lately about your first quilt. But there were many grades, and totally white, medicinal quality, which could be used for other things, down to our cheapest batting, which was full of debris.
And even today with Stearns and Foster, I mean, that's a huge company that does a lot of stuff with batting. I mean, even they talk about one of their big sellers was, it was a medicinal thing that went around the legs of racehorses. And so it's bandages. A lot of anyway.
I can tell you from having taken apart a lot of quilt tops and quilts to save the fabric from the top. When there's even a small amount of that debris in there, that's where some of the stains are coming from. It's just doesn't take much for it to
Good
leak
point.
oil or something. So making a really good quilt with anything but the very best puts you in trouble of getting stains and having it be somewhat lumpy. Even just a little piece will make a lump.
And you know, cottonseed oil now, I mean, the cotton seeds are extremely valuable.
No, that's not even talking about seeds, just the debris. And I'm afraid we are out of time and we have to move on. So
it's my pleasure to introduce Alden O'Brien, who's the costume and textile curator at the DAR Museum, specializing in late 18th and early 19th century clothing and quilts, and she's going to talk about sewing machine stitching.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hang
Off to
on
you.
here. So my myth is maybe a little bit more of a misconception and an over-exaggerated generalization than a strict myth. It's often assumed that because we place extra value on hand sewing and handcrafting today, that this premium and this prioritizing or this value placed on it was always the case. But here is this quilt made in about 1860 by Mary DeLoach Sneed of Waco, Texas, which you see here. That's about where in Texas it is. And the story that came down in the family is this was made with the first sewing machine in Texas, and they were very proud of this. And so clearly she was proud of this. This was nothing to hide. This was something to celebrate. Now, the quilt is a block quilt. It's a pot holder quilt. So each block was made separately and then sewn together, which makes sense because you couldn't manage the whole quilt on a machine, but you could manage a block at a time. And the applique is done mostly by hand, but the quilting of the basket grid is done by machine to kind of emphasize the texture of the basket. And then you can see that the white blocks are done in a very small 1/2-inch grid, which, you know, although we saw that done by hand in Merikay's quilt just now, you know, usually you do a larger grid than that. I mean, this is really, you know, 1/2 inch at most. So she's clearly showing off what the machine can do. And early promotions for the sewing machine made a big deal of how much more quickly you could machine stitch, and it was going to save you so much time. It was heralded as the great liberator of women. It's like, you know, never mind the vote, we want a sewing machine. That's going to free up us up from all that tedious hand sewing for all the tablecloths and sheets and all the clothes that we have to sew, and then we'll be free to make the fun stuff like embroidery or quilts. And in Anita Loscalzo's article in Uncoverings, she pictures several machine quilts and discusses machine quilted quilts from the 19th century. And here's a fairly early one, said to be made with the first sewing machine in Collin County, Texas. So again, she's showing off the fact that she is the first one in her community to have this new technology. It's kind of like today, I imagine, I don't quilt myself, but you know, if you're the first person in your community to have one of those big new long arm quilters, you're going to be pretty excited about that. You know, people celebrated the advent of this new technology and what could be done with it. And I also found that they very early on were making quilting attachments for the machine. So you could do this, and you know, this looks just like what we saw in that quilt. And here's an 1850 quilt in the International Quilt Center collection. You know, it's a Baltimore Alban, and by gosh, if it isn't machine appliqued to some extent, it doesn't say exactly how much. I tried to do a search in their database on how many 19th century quilts were machine pieced or appliqued or quilted, but I couldn't get it to narrow down the dates for me, but there were a lot. Scrolling through the results, there were many, many, many quilts that were either machine pieced, machine appliqued. They didn't have machine quilted as a category. Barbara shared with me this ad, this little article in the Chicago Tribune about a silk quilt that was presented to President Lincoln, made on a Wheeler and Wilson sewing machine, and you see one from about that time period. So I don't know how much product placement money was spent by Wheeler and Wilson to mention this, but this was done. And Julie shared a picture of this quilt, which passed through her hands a number of years ago, which has numerous blocks with both figural quilting and also a lot of inscriptions and names. And it says, made with a Wheeler and Wilson machine. Or I meant to check with Julie before we recorded this. I may have gotten these two quilts confused, but Julie also told me about a machine quilted, decoratively machine quilted quilt in the Oakland Museum in California, which I've not been able to get a photograph of because they're closed and I can't get a reply from the staff. So maybe it's that one that said made on a Wheeler and Wilson machine. Maybe it's this one. But in any case, these two quilts, this one here and the one I don't have a picture of in Oakland, have all of this elaborate machine quilting. And you notice this is in red. It's not in white. They want it to stick out. It's really celebrating what that machine can do. And boy, she would have had to do a lot of turning around on that machine. And she really went to town with it and had fun with it. And just to kind of build on what Barbara was saying about myths as culture and looking into why do we like to believe myths and so on, the DAR is actually doing a program online in just about a week about history myths, why people believe them and what to do about it. And of course, that second phrase kind of shows you that in the museum world, we do want to combat those myths. It's okay to value myths and to tell these stories because it means something to us in the culture. But as historians, we, a lot of us still want to say, okay, but you do know that's not quite true, don't you? And I'm sure that not everybody has an emotional investment in everything. So my key point here is that in the 20th century, after industrialization really took over, that's when you start getting nostalgia for the ye olden days of hand sewing and hand crafting. When you're in the middle of having to do all that sewing by hand, there's nothing romantic or special about it. And you are happy to abandon that and take the sewing machine. But after the machinery becomes commonplace, then we start valuing, oh, look, someone took the extra trouble to make this by hand. And that's when the handmade becomes valuable. So that's just how we need to look at this myth, is realize different things apply to different times. The past is not a monolith. And I'll end there.
Well,
Nice.
I want to say, again, this myth tells us who we are. And what we like to believe lately is that in past times things were simpler, people were happier, they were closer to the land, and they did things by hand. And I'll remind you that Bob Dylan scared everybody when he picked up an electric guitar.
And Julie was there.
Julie was there. Did you spit and throw it? No.
No, I was amused. I was amused.
You're amused. Well, it was incredible. The controversy.
Yeah.
I was there when Carol Breyer Fowler won first prize at Quilt National a little bit later with the machine quilted quilt. I thought people were going to burn the quilt.
Yeah.
It's just, it completely contradicted. I don't like to use the word burnout hippies, but the old hippie idea that everything was better in the past and we should return to doing it all by hand. And it's sort of the Martha Stewart idea where you make your own crackers.
Yeah.
Hey, you can buy crackers.
Can I also say that even though we're talking about women who are embracing this thing, there also is often a correlating strain outside that crafting community. There's often a strain when things start getting less labor intensive of misogyny and let's keep the little woman in her place. You know, I've seen things all the way back to the 1780s and 90s. You know, we don't want women having time to read books. We don't want women having, you know, being able to save time and labor. You know, they're just going to start doing terrible things like going shopping and gossiping and reading books. So, you know, we want to keep the woman, you know, barefoot and ignorant and so on. So, you know, sometimes that's a strain, but mostly I think here it's just romanticized nostalgia, and it's great to value the hand sewing and it's very impressive, but it doesn't mean that that's how they looked at it, you know, in the 19th century. All right, so moving on, it is my great pleasure to introduce my Julie, who is a quilt lover, amateur quilt sleuth, author, buyer, and seller of antique and vintage quilts. She's the curator of quilt exhibitions, including American Quilts, A Handmade Legacy, and Amish, The Art of the Quilt. Also, she was the full-time curator of the Esprit Quilt Collection in San Francisco for a whole bunch of years, as she says. And she is a recent convert to Zoom lecturers and doing a brilliant job of it. And take it away, Julie.
Happy to. Thank you very much. Let's just remind the audience too that I think we all do Zoom lectures and have found it very interesting, and happy to share what we know that way. Let me see if I can share my screen here. The myth I'm going to talk about today is the story that we've all heard so many times. Women put deliberate errors into their quilts. Sometimes they called it the humility block. It is called the humility block. And the purpose of doing so was to not offend God, the only perfect being. And that is usually the explanation for this idea that errors were deliberate. We see it all over the place, and here are a few quotes that I took out of some books. The influence of the Bible, however, was often noted by the quilt maker's inclusion of a small and deliberate mistake, a religious error, to attest to God's perfection in all things, as opposed to the imperfection, however slight, of one's own work. Below that, the red X on one pot describing a quilt represents a deliberate error added in the belief that, since only God is perfect, to make a quilt is to lack humility. And when a woman was making a quilt, which she felt would be perfect, she would deliberately build in a mistake. The error was always in an inconspicuous spot, such as the head or foot of the bed, where it would not detract from the beauty. Not every one of these books of quilt history have that particular myth in them, but several of them do. I included my own book here. We made some mistakes, Hearts and Hands. We made some mistakes, but live and learn, but we didn't make that particular one. But in looking at these old books and some very current books, That's where we see it. So how do we determine whether something is true or not? The important thing to remember here is that the idea of this myth shows up in the literature written by women who were writing about quilts rather than the quilters themselves. And here's another example. However, the quilt maker switched 2 blocks. This is her deliberate error. To further emphasize the symbolic expression of humility, she cut the accent fabric from the bottom right star from a red and white print rather than a solid. The inclusion of a deliberate error in her quilt would be in keeping with this particular quilt maker's strong Baptist faith. Where do we want to look? Instead of looking at the literature from the 20th century, written by women who are writing about quilts rather than the women themselves, we want to look to primary sources. And what do we consider primary sources? Women's letters, their journals, their diaries, their autobiographies, and memoirs. So what we want to do is hear from the women themselves about this kind of thing. And so far, let's get to the bottom line here. So far, there is no evidence that quilters intentionally placed errors in their quilts. That is to say, it's not in any, so far, we haven't found it in any letters, journals, diaries, autobiographies. No primary sources such as those things mention such a practice, and no early oral tradition has been found yet. And I think it's important in this particular myth to say that it still may show up. We may find it in one of these primary sources, but until we do, we consider this a story, a myth, something that pleases us as a culture somehow, and that's something else we can talk about sometime. I want to talk about the Amish for a minute because that is where it tends to come up the most. It comes up about all American quilts, but with Amish quilts, I hear it all the time, and I have a history and a life with antique Amish quilts, so I heard it maybe more than others. But the Amish believe that only God is perfect. This comes from a book. Even though the Amish ladies make perfect, beautiful quilts, the mistake is there to humble themselves and acknowledge that they themselves are not perfect. Many non-Amish quilt makers do this, either for religious reasons or just that it is a tradition. I'm going to talk about Lancaster County Amish quilts for a moment, because these are the quilts that, from that particular community, where it's very difficult to believe, even in looking at them, that there would be anything close to a mistake that was intentional. They are so perfectly made. Certainly there's a possibility, I guess, that somebody did a stitch out of place, but no Amish person, even today, has said that this is part of their tradition and they heard it from mom or grandmother or great-grandmother. Here's another Lancaster County quilt, and you can see how you'd have to look very hard and closely to find anything that was an error, much less a deliberate error. There's always an exception. And not long ago, in the last year, I happened upon this Lancaster County quilt, which is early 20th century, part of the old tradition. And somehow or other, this particular maker, I wouldn't say it's a mistake. I mean, we don't know, we never know what a quilter's intention is or her motivation or what she's thinking unless she writes it down or tells somebody. But I thought it was interesting when I saw this one because I've never seen another Lancaster County quilt that has so many oddities in it. In the Midwest, the traditions are looser and there would be much more room for making a mistake. But then you have to talk about what you mean by mistake, because here, let's see, can I get my cursor? No. On the quilt on the left, if you look at the bottom right, you can see that or all over the quilt, you can see that the quilt maker probably didn't have enough of all the same fabric, but she found some solid color that came close and achieved her intention aesthetically. But even so, no Midwest Amish woman has ever said that she made a mistake. Here's a Midwest quilter. It may be Mifflin County, Pennsylvania, but it is definitely not a Lancaster quilt. And it is so scattered as to not even the idea of a mistake isn't even something that we would even think about in a quilt like this. We might think about the interesting aesthetics, but not the mistake. Janneken Smucker, who is the leading expert today on Amish quilts, says this: the explanation that makers deliberately made a mistake because only God is perfect or some similar reason does not hold true when speaking with actual quilters and other artisans. Many quilt makers are embarrassed or surprised when they notice a mistake and would not deliberately choose to do so. Similarly, Barb Garrett, who's a quilt historian who lives in Pennsylvania, said this: similar to what I was told when I asked Amish ladies, said Pennsylvania quilt maker and historian Barbara Garrett, most common comment I read in a magazine that you all think that about us. That was the first I heard the idea. Amish quilt makers readily admitted mistakes happened and you don't have to plan them. What kinds of errors do we see? The most frequently found and discussed are errors or anomalies in the piecing. And here you see on the bottom left a piece that is different from all the rest. Here in the upper right quadrant, you can see that just like at the last one, it really is switching of the red and the white pieces. Any quilt maker will tell you that's an easy thing to do. And who knows if this quilt maker saw it, and if she saw it, whether it was even intended. In the bottom center here, another switching of the blue and white fabrics. This quilt, which was made before the Nazi era and using a symbol that had friendlier meanings, long life, good health. You can see in the upper, actually it's the two columns on the right, you can see that some of the pieces were switched and make a different design. Barbara put me in mind of this one, which is on the right, the very right column. You can see that in the second row from the bottom on the right, again, the lights and darks were switched, and so that does not make a full star. This very complicated design has a bunch of places where the quilt maker either deliberately and probably not deliberately switched her two colors and made kind of wonky designs. Check here in the middle of the top, second column from the top in the middle. Kind of looks like an airplane, but there's just one, and again, it's the switching of the light and dark. This is a quilt from Bill Volkening's collection. I think I sold it to him, actually. Pictures, and if you look carefully, you'll see that there is one picture that is reversed. It's not facing the same way. It's near the bottom on the left. In the interest of time, I'll give you a clue. Hard to imagine that the woman did this on purpose. But when you cut something out and you sew it that way, I'm told by quilt makers that often you don't want to take it out. On the other hand, who knows? Barbara put me onto this, which was on eBay recently, and I include it because we can explain what looks here perhaps to be a mistake in the left column near the top. So here's the listing in eBay. Fine old vintage Mennonite quilt top, 8-point star, imperfect with humility block. Well, what they don't know is that in the 20th century, we had a dye, an inferior dye called Congo red, and this is exactly what Congo red does when washed or in the sun too long. It turns to this dun color. and it happens frequently. If you don't know that, you might think that somebody made a mistake or at least intended an anomaly. So quilt of mine that has the same issue. I believe that those anchors that are now peachy were once red, and this would be 2 different dye lots. That is to say, she bought it at 2 different times or used 2 different fabrics, didn't know it was going to fade. Here's an anecdote from when I had a shop in the 1970s. A woman came in and she was in her 80s or so. She brought a quilt that she had made in the 1930s that she was very proud of, and she just wanted to show it to us. It was a Burgoyne surrounded, not this one, but it was a Burgoyne surrounded, made of all these blue and white squares organized in this particular way, pretty complicated. And hers was even denser. It had even more pieces than this one. And when she opened it on the table and we were oohing and ahhing about it, and it was beautiful, my eye happened to land on a place where the blue and white had been switched. And it was inconspicuous. I don't know why my eye landed on it, but there it was. And at that time, I knew that the historians had not yet found anybody from the early days who said that she had made an intentional mistake. So I thought, oh, I got it now. I'm gonna get it. I'm gonna make history here. Mrs. Crawford, I said, and I pointed to it. Why did you do this? And she looked right at it and she said, honey, why did I do what? That's an important story. She didn't know, she never saw it, and she didn't even see it when I pointed it out. Each of these 4 blocks has 289 pieces, and it seems to me that it would be relatively easy to switch a light and a dark and not even see it. So another kind of thing that we sometimes call mistakes are turned letters. And on this, you can see this is a quilt that is celebrating the end of World War I on November 11th, 1918. And the N and the 9 are reversed. We don't know why, and I know that Barbara has studied this a little bit, and I'm sure she has something to say. This alphabet quilt has the N backwards, and not only is the N backwards, but she did the alphabet from right to left and from top to bottom. Barbara's going to talk about dyslexia, I think, and that's important. I have seen quilts where it's usually an S or an N, and I've seen quilts where it'll have 3 S's in it, and 2 of them are the right way, and 1 of them is what we call the wrong way. Barbara can talk about how dyslexics don't even see the difference, much less see it as an error. Sometimes we see quilts that have bad spelling, or at least spelling not the way we do it today. Here's a quilt from the turn of the century, the last square, made in April. This, I think what she wanted to say was daisies won't tell. You can't really blame somebody for not having good spelling and really even call it a mistake, but sometimes we do. And this one I found very amusing. I believe what the woman meant to say was, angels sing thee to thy rest. But as you can see, she wrote, angels sing thee to thy rest. I think that's hilarious. I showed it to a friend of mine who said, you know, Julie, geometry put me to sleep too. So these, I won't really read, I'm going to read the last one only, but these are people who are saying that the idea of a deliberate error is ridiculous. The last woman says, this is a load of fertilizer. If their premise is correct, making a deliberate mistake would imply that the maker is so perfect, the only way she can avoid offending God is to pretend to be imperfect. By this standard, I must be a really great quilt maker because I don't have to pretend to make a mistake. And I'm going to end here, but you know, we don't know for sure. But sometimes you really have to wonder about why somebody would make an anomaly in their quilt. And in this next quilt, you'll see it, and I think you'll understand that it's hard to know, hard to imagine why somebody would do such a thing. I haven't shown very many applique quilts, and I don't know how long it'll take you all to find it. But in the interest of time, I'm going to tell you that it's in the middle row, second from the right. I can't
Left.
explain it.
Left.
I don't know if
Left.
anybody else can, but there we go. The intentional error.
Amazing.
Yeah, I think the main point is, it's very arrogant to think that your quilt is so perfect that you have to add a mistake. Any quilter must know that there are mistakes there anyway, as that last quote said. That's always been my thought about it.
Yeah.
Well, I want
Yeah.
to say, I have several things to say. Dyslexia. I was a reading teacher for many years, and many people with a directionality problem will automatically start on the right instead of the left, as we do in the Western world. This is nothing compared to things I've seen. And the only way you can fix it is with drill, training. And so many of these women didn't have any formal education, much less an excellent reading teacher like I was. And the other thing I want to say is that I was fortunate enough to have a Mennonite mother-in-law. And she was raised in the very traditional Kansas Mennonite community. She was born in 1917. So when I first read this myth, I thought, here's my opportunity. So I said to her, I've heard that Mennonites make a deliberate error in their quilt so as to appear humble before God. And she, all 4'11" of her, stood up, and she was very indignant. And she said, Mennonites do not try to appear humble. I mean, they are humble. It just offended her no end.
Thanks.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure to introduce Debby Cooney, a friend of mine who is a quilt historian, a collector with a special interest in quilts made in a 200-mile radius of Washington, D.C., Maryland, Southern Pennsylvania, and Northern Virginia, and she lives in that neck of the woods. So, Debby.
Thank you, Julie. And thanks to the work of Gee's Bend quilters, as well as scholars and collectors, many of them, the term improvisational quilts has come to be associated with African-American quilters from the Deep South through Texas and even to California. There is some general agreement that improvisation in quilt making includes creative spontaneity guided by imagination and intuition, varying the size and placement of cloth components, and a disregard for traditional patterns and layouts. Opinions are mixed on other elements of this type of quilt and the process of improvising itself. While the use of materials at hand, whether recycled or salvaged, was a necessity in the early Gee's Bend community's now famous output, new fabrics were often the choice of later quilt artists such as Rosie Lee Tompkins. New York Times art critic Roberta Smith praised the power of abstraction in some of Rosie's velvet quilts. In one, Smith saw shapes sliding in and out of register, creating the illusion of ceaseless motion. And the same may be said for this quilt on the screen now. Curator and scholar Carolyn Mazlumi described improvisation as being able to make a quilt without a pattern. In her exhibition, Textural Rhythms, Quilting the Jazz Traditions, Mazlumi compared the two artistic forms as inspirations for each other. And the late collector and scholar Eli Leon thought that African Americans favored flexible patterning, in which the design is conceived as an invitation to variation rather than repetition. He also saw a distinctly different African American aesthetic of improvisation in the irregular patterns that he just dubbed Afro-traditional quilts. I think of the characteristics of improvisation are shared by quilt makers of African Americans and other communities. The explosion of interest in African American quilts since the 1970 Gee's Bend exhibition and books was long overdue. The intense focus on their improvisational quilts has led to a re-examination of similar examples made in this style in other areas. And in fact, this first quilt was made in Adams County, Pennsylvania, near Gettysburg. Pieces of medium weight wools were probably leftovers from coat or suit construction. No pattern was needed. The maker just seemed to have gone with the flow. And this one is a Connecticut sampler of the same period, which could easily be mistaken for a Southern quilt with its broken patterns, bright colors, irregular combinations of scales that create movement in all directions. But let's back up and look at some 19th century quilts that I'll call random pieced and let each viewer decide if they are improvisational. Barbara pointed out this one to me. It's an early historic New England quilt, which combines hundreds of scraps, many of them from handsome imported textiles. These pieces probably were remnants too good to discard from dressmaking projects. The jumbled mixture of different scales hides the off-kilter frame center of this layout. It starts with a small checkerboard in the center, followed by larger blocks in the middle, then reduced scale shards and triangles on the edges. Except for the muted colors, this quilt could be seen as an example of African American aesthetics and patterning. But the quilt came from the Harold family, English immigrants to the San Joaquin Valley of California in 1850. So the quilt did not come with them. From many people and many quilt historians who have seen it, a Pennsylvania origin is most often suggested. In contrast, the center of this Maryland quilt has no structure. The largely triangular blocks are sewn free-form with a few strips and rectangles in a large variety of fabrics typical of the 1880s. They were fashionable and available to people of very modest means, judging by the home from which this quilt was sold. The rest of the slides are going to pair an African American quilt on the left, considered to have the qualities of improvisation and abstraction, with a Maryland or Pennsylvania example known or presumed to be from a different community. Quilts made after emancipation until the 20th century in styles that African American makers chose themselves are rare. So I've chosen fairly recent examples with known provenance, assuming that this is a style that developed over a number of decades. These two here, strip-pieced and block quilts, have a lot in common in terms of color and placement of shapes, even though they were made 100 years apart. Style changes in the 1880s included crazy quilt construction. And Barbara has found an 1883 illustration of a quilt border of irregular geometric forms described as hit or miss. Both of these innovations affected quilt making into the 20th century. And here we see that the velvets were a favorite fabric of Rosie Lee Tompkins, a pseudonym for Effie Mae Howard. As a girl in the 1940s, she quilted with her mother in Arkansas. She moved to Richmond, California, where she took up quilt making again about 1980. Eli Leon, who collected many of her quilts, said that while improvisational quilts may look spontaneous, they do require technical proficiency and quilting know-how. Marlene Bennett Jones's quilt, titled My Way, is more loosely combined than the tightly packed schoolhouse example from rural northwest area of Philadelphia, but the colors same colors are employed in both. This sampler on the left is attributed to Josie Covington, an African American of Williamson County, Tennessee. In a blog post, Barbara describes it as perhaps a combination of patterns saved for future patchwork or examples of designs sold by pattern publishers in the early 20th century. The sampler from Lebanon County, Pennsylvania, uses the same bright colors favored by local quilt makers. Housetops is a frequent pattern made by Gee's Bend quilters and Rosie Lee Tompkins. Termed log cabin in Pennsylvania, this pattern was popular there as well as all across the country at that point. The abstracted circle is rendered as positive negative in 2 colors by Lucy Petway, while the Pennsylvania quilt uses a range of calicos to achieve the same look. Both of these quilts have the look of discards or factory cutaways made beautiful again. And here, strip quilt, housetops, 2 very different examples. And our last one, housetops variations and log cabin. So, do we see improvisation in both North and South, do you think?
Yes.
Well, your pairing there, your pairs of quilts just make your point.
I hope so.
Yes.
Yeah.
What can we say? You know, I think there's a commercial. Now, Julie's a dealer, but Julie wouldn't do this. There's a commercial thing that people do because the G's Ben quilts are worth so much money. People will assign an African American provenance when they don't know, because that's sort of what the myth is, and also because they know they could get more money for it. And
Yeah, you're right.
It's a commercial.
Yeah.
You know, I believe that that is also true to some extent about the deliberate error. I think that is a selling point. It's not one of mine, but I do believe that if somebody is buying a quilt and they point out this, you know, this anomaly, that people who are selling the quilt, dealers or anybody else, might say, "Oh yeah, you know, there's this tradition in America," and I think that's very appealing to a lot of people.
And in fact, with going back to Ruth Finley, there apparently was some kind of, was called unginned, if dealers would say there was unginned cotton inside the quilt, and that would be
Selling
a
point.
plus. It'd be a reason to sell the quilt, right or wrong. I mean, this,
Money.
well,
But to your point of, is this North or South, Debbie? By the way, I thought your comparisons were fabulous.
Fabulous.
Thank you.
It makes me think of those bolt-end quilts that I talked about in, what was their
Connecticut.
first or second
Mhm.
know-it-alls presentation, where and these are all in New England, although we don't know, we don't have provenance on any of them. But it really makes me think that these 1820s quilts that are made from all these kind of often very randomly shaped strips of bolt ends are just this hit or miss idea. And yes, they were made here in New England.
Mhm.
Mhm. Mhm.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Well, I also think, you know,
Hmm.
Debbie mentioned that I had recently called her attention to an 1883 article, which actually had a pattern for a hit or miss quilt. That's what every naive quilter wants, is the pattern for an improvisational quilt. But anyway, in 1883, you could get one. And 1883 is the very beginning of the crazy quilt fashion. And I think crazy quilts really gave people a license all over the country to just do things that were more spontaneous. The block quilt repeat idea. It was old fashioned, and crazy quilts were modern and new.
True.
Wow.
Yeah.
We've come to the end.
Yeah.
So,
It's not exactly the end, kids, because although our presentations are over in a few minutes, after a small intermission, you're going to have the opportunity to talk with us. That is to say, if you have any questions or comments, put them in the chat, and we will attempt to respond to as many of them as we can. We promise you a half an hour, and if there are more questions and we keep going and you want to stick around, that will be fine too. We do want to take this opportunity to thank Tara Miller, who is our technician and saves our lives in so many ways and does such wonderful things for us. I don't know where we'd be without her. So many thanks to Tara. And Tara will put up on the screen, either during the intermission or at the very end, contact information for each of the 6 of us. So if you want to get in touch with us privately, you can do that too. So let's take a little break, and we'll see you soon in a few minutes.
Tara, are you going to field the questions? Tara?
All right, everybody, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep, and get our panelists unmuted here. Debbie and Barbara, you're still muted. And all right, everyone, we're going to take Q&A live here. And thanks, guys, for an awesome episode. That was fantastic. Oh my gosh, I enjoyed it so much. That's probably my favorite one so far. So a reminder for our attendees, you'll see there's a Q&A panel and there's also a chat panel. We're going to focus on the Q&A panel for this section. And so if you have a question, can you please pop it into that panel? I will try to also look in the chat, but I'm going to be focusing on the Q&A panel there. You'll see that icon at the bottom where you see the chat icon too. So, all right, well, let's dig in. Okay, so let's see. I think this one is probably, well, for any of you, from Lynne DeMarco. We're going to have, she wants to know if what is your advice when you come across some of these myths when they're presented as facts at some local museums or historical sites? Is there a polite way to rectify these misconceptions?
Oh boy.
Yeah.
You don't want to do it in the middle of the tour and shame or embarrass the tour leader, that's for sure. Because that's just mean and unpleasant, and you're just being a show off and a know-it-all in the wrong sense of the word. And but I've occasionally, heard something and just stayed behind and just quietly chatted with the person, not in a challenging way, not in a way to show that I know so much, but just say, I was really interested to hear you say that, but it just so happens that this is my background, and you might be interested to know that there's a lot of research about this, or it's a common misconception that gets spread around a lot, as many phrases to kind of give them an out, like this is a very common thing, lots of people think it, but you might be interested to know that blah blah blah, and just in a way that is not confrontational and doesn't put them on the defensive or make them feel stupid.
I think that what might also be effective, if you're really committed to this, is to follow up with a letter, an email, and actually give sources for the correct information.
That's true, yeah.
Great idea.
And the docent is just repeating what they've been taught, right, or what they've read. And so the more sensible thing is to write to the director or the head of education if it's a place that's large enough to have someone who's in charge of training the guides and so on, and say, I was interested, and just say it again, obviously politely and so on. But you're right, to show the sources and all of that is even more helpful.
And nevertheless, be prepared to be rejected.
Yeah.
As in, I know all of this and I believe it anyway. I believe it.
Or just flat out, it's a better story.
Right.
They might not really admit it, but that's often what it boils down to.
Well, myths hold on for a reason, and they hold on for very deep reasons, cultural reasons, and
well, they make people feel good.
Yeah.
All right, Alex Anderson. Hi, Alex. She wants to know, what is the rooftop blocks or quilts? She said she's never heard of the rooftop blocks.
Housetop.
Housetop?
Housetop.
Housetop. I happen to have been looking at a lot of them lately, and I made some. It's just a log cabin that is concentric squares. Log cabins often, as Debbie showed in her last slide, have a sunshine and shadow kind of coloring, but housetop blocks are concentric, shaded concentrically. And I've done a little work. They're very popular in the South, but they were also popular in the North, especially during the heyday of the log cabin in the 1880s, made in wools and silks and cottons too. So it's a name for a pattern. And on my blog recently, my pen pal Louise mentioned that she has found several references 2 log cabins called bird traps. And I knew nothing about bird traps until I looked it up. It's a nasty little thought. Who wants to catch a bird? But anyway, they look a lot like a housetop quilt or a log cabin. Concentric squares built up. Keep that bird trapped in there.
I think rooftop is another name for what you're calling house top. I think it's just another way to refer to the same design.
Well, Pepper has pointed out in a comment that roof tile was a term used in Manx, and the connection between the Manx quilts and the US is fascinating. And so far, I don't think there's too much evidence to show how it happened or where it happened, what time period exactly, but the visual similarity is quite startling, and theirs are earlier than ours. So,
Debbie, for those of our audience who don't know what a Manx quilt is, could you please describe that?
oh, from the Isle of Manx in England, they seem to have come up with the pattern, some very similar to what we call log cabin or housetops in the 1830s or 40s. And they don't really show up here, as far as we know, until like about the 1850s. So if it was immigration and whatever publications, I guess that's still to be determined.
And look back in your old volumes of uncoverings for an article about quilts from the Isle of Man.
Yeah, and aren't
'cause I
they?
edited an article, oh gosh, it was probably 5 or 6 years ago now.
And for those who are new to us, Uncoverings is the monograph that's published every year by American Quilt Study Group, of which we are all members. And we enjoy one another and all the other members for being able to engage in just this kind of thing all year long. But there's a book, a publication every year called Uncoverings that publicizes the papers that were given at each year's seminar. American Quilt Study Group.
Thank you. And if you're interested in quilt history, I assume lots of people here are already members, but if you're not, that's the group to belong to.
Definitely.
Plus we're fun.
Yeah.
You saw Mary Kay dancing a second ago. All right, Lynn, I think this question might be for you, from Charlene Stevens, and she wants to know, why would the paper templates have been left in those finished quilts?
I don't know, but all of the ones from the 18th century still have, if they haven't been messed with, they still have their paper templates. That seems to just be the way that they did it. Maybe they felt it kept it crisper. Maybe they thought it offered a little more insulation. I don't know. I mean, the Anna Tools quilt, which is completely finished, has a little batting, it's quilted all the way through, has its paper templates. And every 18th century patchwork I've seen, it's got paper templates still in it. And sometimes even into the 19th century, the hexagons, the early hexagons, they still have their paper templates.
And they're not going to be washed if they're silk.
Right. Or like Anna Tools is mostly wool, which would also be problematic to wash. But yeah, also you have to keep in mind that paper in that period was made out of linen and cotton, so it's not going to be as self-destructing as the later wood pulp papers. So they might have just thought, you know, it's practically another textile. I don't know.
It's almost an interfacing, really.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a really good point. I hadn't even considered that, Lynn.
Because it's silk, you know, they're working with silk, and I've tried making silk quilts without any interfacing of any kind. You get a lump. They are really hard to keep square. And so probably when you take that paper out, you start getting distortion. And don't forget there's sheer human laziness.
I wouldn't want to take those darn things out. Then again, I wouldn't want to make that a quilt made of thousands of pieces anyway.
You are not qualified as you just make clothes.
If I spend 3 hours working with fabric, I want to be halfway through cutting and basting a dress. I don't want to have some teeny tiny piece of fabrics.
We're gonna torture you with making you do paper patchwork.
Now, if I'm a very bad person in this world, they're going to make me make patchwork quilts in the next.
Right, yes.
Lynn, I believe this one is also for you, or any of you really, but this came in during your segment from Bernadine Heller, and she'd like to know, would you please explain exactly what was covering the bed, if not quilts?
Well, research in probate inventories primarily, and also like merchant accounts and ship records and such. The most popular bed covering, if you even bothered to have a bed cover, keep in mind you didn't have to have a bed cover, you could just have blankets. But the most common bed cover was a rug, a bed rug. And I'm going to take on that subject in a future 6 know-it-alls and explain what bed rugs are and how they're made and all that sort of stuff. So join us later. I'll leave it there.
Aren't they looped yarns? I don't know.
Should I tell?
Look
Just
at
make
it,
it.
Oh, look in your satin.
Yes
It
and
depends.
no.
You know, they were imported, in which case they were woven with a supplementary looped weft. When they were made domestically, they tended, not always, and there's a difference between southern bed quilts and northern bed quilts. Northern bed quilts tend to be embroidered to imitate that looped weft. And I'll leave it there.
Leave
Yes.
it there.
Leave
Tune
us-
in next
leave
time.
us wanting more. All right, Pat Gottschalk would like to know, do you suppose have community quilt documentation projects promoted quilting myths or family lore? Do you think that that's been part of what has perhaps kept that going?
Oh, I don't think so. Oh,
I blame the books.
yeah. All the documentations I've been involved with, everybody is very carefully told about how to conduct themselves and what to ask for. And so no, I don't think it. I think books and commentary on various media have been responsible for that.
And I think another source of it a lot is docents. I've done several quilt exhibitions, as I think we all have. And I followed, the first time I did it, I trained docents. I told them everything. This is the Oakland Museum show, American Quilt's Handmade Legacy. I told the docent, I gave them a session, and then I followed them around. And it was unbelievable what they made of what I said. So
Wow.
ever since then, what I've done is, and then they insert what they have heard or read, and often they are the quilt myths. And what I decided since then is every time I do an exhibition at a museum, I train the docents once, and then I ask to train them again after their first go round, because they need to hear it more than once. But it's really unbelievable, and I think it has. This may be controversial, but I think it has a little bit to do with how the personality that wants to be a docent often is a person who wants to be the expert. And even if they don't actually know, they want to sound authoritative. And if they've heard something like that, they could easily pass it on. And that's certainly not true across the board. But my experience is that they want to be right and want to be the authority. So
It's really hard because you can give a person, a museum, an institution, the correct information on a silver platter, and they will still choose to ignore it. I assisted with an exhibition that the institution will remain anonymous, but I wrote the catalog for it, and the museum handled the labels. I gave them all the information for the labels, and they still put in the Underground Railroad code
Oh my God.
myth. And when I saw that, I said, you have to change this immediately now. I mean, my name is associated with this exhibition. I want you to change it now. They never changed it.
Oh my God.
That's
So,
incredible.
you know,
Yeah, and Julie, I think you also have to tell people, okay, this is what I'm telling you, but it maybe part of the training needs to be, what have you heard that you think you know about this? And let's go over some of it, because some of it you might have heard some things that now we've done more research than when that, you know,
Right.
again, not your fault. These things get spread, you know, blah, blah, blah. Also, the question about the quilt documentation project, Debbie, I was interpreting that as not blaming the people taking down the information, but rather the people coming with the family lore may be spreading the myths. But I think each individual family may only have lore from you know, one individual family. They may not be plugged into larger quilt myths. Except for the famous, oh, this got buried in the backyard when the Yankee soldiers came by, and that's why it's in bad shape. And, you know, I'd like a dime for every Southern quilt that was supposedly buried in the backyard when the Yankees came through.
that did happen once in a while.
It did happen.
Don't
It
say
did
that.
I
happen.
know it did. I know. I'm not saying it never happened. I'm just saying it's one of those things that spread far and
It's
wide,
one of
and
those-
you would need to say, okay, where were you, and did Southern troops actually come through your backyard in
It's a
1862?
sunbonnet Sioux quilt. It couldn't have been buried with the silver during
But
this.
there are letters.
Of
specifically
course, I'm not
mentioned.
saying it never happened. I'm just saying these things spread as if it happened to absolutely every quilt in the South, practically. I'm sorry, unrepentant Northerner
Maybe
here.
one of the issues is just the increased visibility that the documentation projects have given to quilts. And people are just more thinking more about it. They're more aware, and so they pick up on these things, whereas they would have completely ignored it before.
Well, I asked well, Holly Anderson, who worked a lot in Georgia on the state quilt project, and I think she's an appraiser now. I said, what does it mean when people say, look, there's cotton seeds inside my family quilt? And I think there's a bit of pride in it, maybe. Maybe that's what's going on. And maybe they do want to show, it may not be seeds at all, but they just want to say, my family went out and scrapped in the, you know, they made this all by hand. The hard
Pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, sort of thing.
Well, all the documentation projects, except for, well, all of them have been in Pennsylvania. And each one of them is very careful to have one or two people who are kind of consultants to the project, who are the ultimate authority, because a lot of the actual scribing is done by local volunteers. And so if there's ever a question that they don't know, they take it to the consultant. Or
I don't think that was true at all in every state by any
I'm
means.
sure it wasn't, but
Better
at
than
least
others.
that cut down on misinformation being traded back and forth, at least in the Pennsylvanias, where they did it almost county by county, especially in the southeastern part of the state.
Yeah, that was a very special project, that one. And it was headed by folklorists and other academics who'd been used to, that was fascinating. One of the things I found most fascinating that I heard way back then was that Jeanette Lisansky, who I think was involved in the beginnings of that documentation project, she was the first person that I ever heard of in these documentation projects who suggested that it was way better to go to somebody's home than to have people come to you. Because when you ask people to bring quilts to you, they pick the best from their family. There might be 6 quilts. They'll pick what they consider to be the best. But if your goal is to find out what was typical, what you really want is to see the best and the worst and everything in between, because you want to see everything. And I know there were quilt documentation days in Pennsylvania, but I loved her interpretation of it and what it led to, which was that you saw the idea was to see everything, which was carried over by Dave Pottinger, when he did his Indiana Amish project, he went to those houses and asked to see everything, including scraps, because he wanted to get a picture of what the Indiana Amish were making, not the best quilts that the Indiana Amish were making.
You know, we did ours, I'd say 30, 40
No, we
years.
did ours. I'd say
Uh-oh.
30, 40 years.
Well, anyway,
Sorry, Barbara. What?
been done. I think it's time for people to continue to do it, small scale, county by county, get a little money from the County Historical Society or a grantor of some kind, and then keep those records locally. But as you say, maybe go into people's homes. But it's not done. It's not done. What we didn't know what we were doing.
Right.
We found out so much.
You know, that's why I think one of the questions was, well, shall we throw out Ruth Finley? I mean, no. We all, I think, relate to Ruth Finley and where, you know, where she was in 1929 and where we are today. And I think we really want people to keep looking at the quilts, keep digging, reviewing some of these records. Like Alden, I really wonder if that quilt, that Baltimore album quilt, has machine applique on it. Woo. That could have been, I looked on the record.
That's what the record says.
I know. I wonder if there might be, I mean, see, I guess when you become a know-it-all, you begin to really question.
You become a skeptic.
You become a
Yeah.
skeptic, yes.
First you're a skeptic, then you're
Well, that's a good segue for this quick question. Stephanie Whitson asked me to talk about the quilt behind me. And I just really quickly will mention, because Alden, it ties into your talk and what you just said about machine applique. And though this is not as finely done as that Baltimore album quilt, that is machine applique. And it's also machine text. It's very hard for you to see that here, but it's Bible verses.
Right.
And it's just a coverlet, a summer spread. It's not, there is no batting in it, and it was done block by block. I can see where she quilted it as she went, so to speak. So,
and then bound and put together as what we call pot holder quilts.
right.
You know where it's from? Tara, do you know where it's from?
I don't have provenance on it. I got it off of eBay.
Pretty nice. It's a nice quilt.
Okay, so here is a deep one, if you're ready to go deep. Joanne Zeiss, I hope I've said that right. I was wondering if you might speak to the role of enslaved workers in quilt making. I wonder if we see a name on a quilt and that person owned many enslaved people, are we assuming they did not have assistance from someone they enslaved? And I mean, aside from that, the fact those women that had enslaved workers meant that they had time and resources to work on very intricate quilts.
Can I answer that a little bit to begin with? I dealt with this in my exhibit, Ion Elegance, which is online at ionelegance.dar.org. I wanted to say it was about Southern quilts, or Maryland and Virginia quilts, and many of these women, most of our quilts, we knew who made them. I could go look them up or their husbands up in the census, and it said how many enslaved men and women they had, and depending on the census year, you know, what age divisions they would be. So I said in my labels, there were X number of enslaved women above the age of 10 or whatever, who might have had sewing skills and might have helped part of the time on this quilt. And at the very least, they were doing the other labor and the boring sewing, which freed up the lady of the house and her friends and her daughters to work on it. There isn't a lot of documentation because, and Gloria Seaman Allen did a lot of research into these quilts for her earlier exhibits at the DAR in the 80s on Maryland and Virginia quilts, two separate exhibits. Some of you might have First Flowerings or the Maryland book, whose name I can't think of right now. She did a lot of research into diaries and inventories and so on. There isn't a lot of, you know, we would love to have the great quote that says, oh, I let, you know, Patty and Dinah or asked them to help me with my quilt today. I'm sure that when they had friends over, it was a segregated kind of thing and only the white ladies were doing the quilting. But that's not to say that they weren't saying, oh, here, you know, Jane and Margaret, please work on this quilt for me because I know you're good at stitching. There were very, very skilled seamstresses in those households who were Black, enslaved, and free. So, you know, I think you can guess it's quite possible that some of them could have been helping with the piecing and or the quilting. But it's a little bit elusive to find the written proof. But yes, I think we need to talk about it, and I think we need to talk about the system that allowed the Black labor that allowed the leisure for the white ladies to make their quilts. And quilting was almost always cooperative, you know, North and South. I mean, Lynne has documented scores of New England diaries, and you know, so often, you know, you might do the piecing, but then your friends come over and help you quilt, and it's not a big bee, it's just people drop by and help you quilt. So you might say
although that becomes less common in the 19th century.
Less common in the 19th century. Thank you for that note. But you know, just because it says this is Jane Jones's quilt doesn't mean there weren't other hands, white and possibly Black, working on it.
Merikay, do you want to address this with chintz quilts?
You're
on mute, Merikay.
muted.
Merikay and I
Wonderful,
worked
Barbara.
on chintz quilts in South Carolina for a couple of years. And I think we miss one big important thing when we talk about how quilts came into being, that it is a commercial enterprise. So you want to, now you can, we can hear you. You want to talk about it?
No, go ahead.
Oh, well, you know, you look at the quilts in Southern museums, and they're gorgeous, very elaborate quilts, mostly chintz, a lot of applique, cutout chintz. And here we have a very important, very wealthy woman with many slaves, is attributed to and it's got, sometimes has her name on it in ink. She made nothing else. She has no sampler. She has no needlework except for this one quilt. And we do feel that a lot of these quilts came out of commercial workshops in the South, where women made them, sold them, and then the wealthy bought them, and possibly they could buy, I think they could buy them either quilted or not, but they might buy a top and have the women quilt them. And I've read a lot of diaries. I've read a lot of people. One of my favorites, I can still remember it. She said, rainy day, had the women in the field come in and help me quilt. You know, quilting is something you can just say, here, draw these straight lines, and you don't have to do prep. Now, there's a lot of women kept a seamstress who was fantastic in their home, and she did their clothing and all the household goods. And I would imagine she did a lot of the blocks. But I think a lot of those Southern, very, you know, coastal Southern chintz quilts were made in commercial workshops in Savannah and Charleston.
Here's something to think about too, that you could get a woven coverlet made for you and have your name put on it.
Mm-hmm.
You could get a Bolton type spread made for you and have your name put on it. Why couldn't you have a quilt made for yourself and have your name put on it?
Because it destroys the myth of one woman, one quilt working by candlelight.
Sorry.
Well, a very good resource in this regard is Rhonda McAllen's paper for the uncoverings in 2018 on the quilted gardens of Axa Wilkins, who was known by her descendants to have been helped by, as she called them, young colored girls whom she trained. Whether they were slaves or not is a big part of the discussion in Rhonda's paper. So that would definitely be worth taking a look at.
There's much work that has to be done in this. And I think what business records in the South, you know, there are records of women doing sewing commercially, and those need to be explored more. We also, I think, just reading more diaries. Many are published every year, but so many are unpublished. And these are the diaries of the slaveholders I'm talking about. No diaries from the women who actually did the work.
I'd be interested, Debbie, in investigating further a connection between those quilts that you showed. Which might have influenced the other, if they influenced each other for those different styles, or for those similar styles in different locations. Could the slave owners have been influenced by that style to create, like, which came first, the chicken or the egg kind of thing?
Well, the ones that I picked out, I know the backgrounds of those, and they are mostly from Pennsylvania and Maryland farm auctions. I would say that they're so simple in construction that they didn't really have a pattern. And so I don't think there was a lot of, there might not have been a lot of transfer. Strip piecing is just kind of the very basic. And those you see all over Pennsylvania and Maryland, but only in certain conditions. They don't come to market that often because especially in this area, in that area, the people were across the board were of a higher, enough of an economic stature that they didn't have to sew work clothes together. Instead, they sewed fabric from their suits and coats. I've noticed a lot of them are wool, and that makes me think that they valued the wool fabric because it was more expensive and they couldn't bear to throw it away. So they would put it together in a random sort of fashion, but those don't come to the market because they are not valued that much in this area of the country. It is not, until recently, it has just not been something that people were that attuned to. So I don't know that there's a lot of transfer of these very simple patterns. I think it probably grew up just from having extra around, and the patterns were simple enough that they grew up independently.
Thanks, thank you. All right, so a couple of questions here. Sue is asking about contact information. I'm going to send out the contact information for all the 6 know-it-alls along with the link to the recording. So everyone can expect to have that. And Sarah Goer was asking how we can find out about future 6 know-it-alls talks. I'll also include links to the Facebook groups where we announce those. As well, you of course can contact any of these ladies and have them and hire them for your guild or your museum or your quilt show.
Kara, I have a question. When people sign up for a talk, do we get their email? Do we have a mailing list?
We do.
So if they've signed up for this talk, can we tell them that they will get a notice of the next one? And let's talk about, I guess I didn't let you answer, but let's talk about the next ones that we have now organized this, and that we're going to do it every month on the 2nd Wednesday of the month. And people can prepare for that at this time. And so that's something we can tell them now. And then if they are on our mailing list or any other way of being in touch with us, we can give them the specifics.
Absolutely. So everyone who has signed up and purchased a ticket for this episode is on the mailing list, and we'll get that notification. Thanks, Julie, for the reminder. All right. Does anybody have anything else?
I'm going to go to my dinner. Someone has been cooking. So
I can't hear you. What did you say?
I'm going to go eat dinner.
Oh, good idea.
So,
I like Joe's guitar music. What do you think?
I didn't hear it. I'm the only one who didn't hear it, and I was there.
Either.
Well, I didn't hear it when we were recording it, but I heard it. Yeah,
I heard it.
Yeah.
Well, let's take a moment to explain. I did my taping at Joe Cunningham's studio, and he wasn't in the room with me, but he was in the next room, and he was practicing for a a concert that I actually heard on Sunday, which was the entire Abbey Road album done by Joe's band and some other people. It was just great. But anyway, he was practicing that day, and I'm glad you got to hear it.
Before we close down, I thought I had seen a question asking for a source on feed sacks.
Yes.
Asking.
No,
Okay, I don't know. I haven't read it yet, but it's the only one that I know of.
I'll go get you another 2.
Okay, well, we should not, we should
You
answer the
shouldn't.
question if it comes through. Sorry.
Oh, I was hoping that Mary Kay would take on feed sacks as one of the.
Okay, well, there we go.
Yeah, let's do that because
Mary
there
Kay's
is
next assignment.
so much to know about them and a lot of misinformation. So
Well, a lot of people are interested in feed sacks, I think, because of it's the latest piece of vintage fabric that's available.
Yeah.
And
Well, there you
the
go.
the
You've
one
got
you
your
showed
time.
is good because it has so many different, people like to identify their prints on their sacks. So that one is especially good for that.
Well, I, as I said, there's actually not a lot of text in here.
Right.
It's mostly
It's the
pictures,
history
which
is-
can be very helpful.
Right.
So,
Mary Ann Montgomery's is really good.
okay, I guess I need to get that one,
She's going to be speaking at AQSG, so at the seminar.
which I'm not.
That's
able to
one
go.
reason why I didn't really want to,
I have that one. I can show it.
yeah. That's really why I wanted to let her do it, but anyway, I wrote the foreword to that book, but a lot of people, yeah, cotton and thrift.
Mm.
Okay,
well, we're gonna have an audience here, Mary Kay, that you know, there's
Okay.
no problem with having more than one expert talk about
Yep.
them. For sure.
Okay.
That's our audience.
All
Thank you.
right, everybody.
All right.
I
Thank you.
will send out the link to the recording tomorrow to everyone who attended. And thanks so much for everybody's.
Thanks for hanging in there with us, everybody.
Thank you.
thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.